It began as a tradition, a gift, a gesture of goodwill between the families. But over centuries, dowry became something far darker, a price tag placed on a woman's life. In ancient South Asia, dowry was meant to secure a bride's financial stability, gold, land, textiles, wealth offered to ensure her comfort after marriage. But as patriarchy deepened and inheritance laws favored men, this offering twisted into expectation, then demand, and finally, violence. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the practice had already transformed into a social weapon. Dowry was no longer about love or security. It was transaction, a negotiation of worth measured in rupees and possessions. In villages, gossip passed like fire. She brought less gold than promised. In cities, families weighed brides not by character, but by how much she could bring. And if a bride's family could not pay or refused, she often paid the price herself. Colonial records from the British Raj show early glimpses of this horror. Coroners in Bengal and Bombay noted cases of accidental kitchen fires. Young women found charred beside hearths or lamps. But beneath these so-called accidents lay something deliberate. Investigations were rare, confessions even rarer. The language of these reports was sterile, bureaucratic, almost detached. Death by misadventure, self-inflicted burns. Yet witnesses whispered the truth. These were not accidents, they were punishments. Dowry killings emerged as a method of silent control. They were not sudden explosions of rage, but slow, systematic acts of pressure and cruelty. A bride might be harassed for months, denied food, humiliated in front of in-laws, or locked away until her family sent more money. And when no more could be sent, the accident would happen. Kerosene, matches, or stoves, common household items became instruments of murder. The origins of bride burning are tangled in a culture that prized honor over humanity. In some regions, a woman's death was considered less shameful than the exposure of family conflict. Neighbors turned away. Police accepted bribes. Priests spoke of karma. The silence surrounding these deaths was not ignorance. It was complicity. Even as modernization spread, the violence adapted. By the early 20th century, newspapers across South Asia began reporting an alarming pattern: educated women, newly married, dying under suspicious circumstances. The explanations never changed. Her sari caught fire while cooking. She tripped near the stove. Yet behind the walls, witnesses told of screams, locked doors, and dowry demands and men. In colonial courts, such cases were treated as domestic disputes, not crimes. British administrators, unfamiliar or unwilling to challenge local customs, often left them to native jurisdiction. Their indifference helped normalize the violence. To the colonial state, dowry disputes were a cultural problem, not a matter of justice. And so the system persisted, refined by law, protected by silence. By the time independence came, the pattern was already too deep. The new governments inherited not only the laws, but also the social rot behind them. Newspapers from the 1950s and 1960s described the same scenes as those a century earlier. Newlywed women burned alive in kitchens, their families pleading for justice that rarely came. The term dowry death entered public vocabulary not as an anomaly, but as a regular headline. Behind each case was a family torn apart. Parents who had spent everything to marry off their daughters, only to receive their bodies back in wooden boxes. In rural courts, judges hesitated to convict without direct witnesses, even when evidence screamed otherwise. Honor again outweighed truth. By the 1970s, the outcry could no longer be ignored. Women's groups began documenting the killings, compiling testimonies from survivors. They uncovered a pattern so consistent, so horrifying, that it became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. One activist wrote, "The dowry system is not tradition. It is organized terror." Police reports revealed how these deaths were staged. Kerosene was poured over saris. The doors were locked from outside. In-laws rehearsed their statements, claiming the woman was depressed or careless. Neighbors stayed quiet, fearing reprisal. Even hospitals played a role, recording burn victims as suicide attempts without further investigation. Medical officers spoke later of women arriving still alive, skin blackened, gasping not for air, but for justice. Some managed to whisper their husband's name before dying. Others refused to speak at all, knowing that even if they survived, there would be nowhere to return to. The cruelty of dowry killings was not just physical. It was systemic, rooted in an economy that made women liabilities, in families that measured worth through wealth, and in laws that treated domestic violence as private sorrow rather than public crime. But resistance grew in the 1980s as cases rose sharply across India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal. The legal systems began to react slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. Special provisions were added to penal codes, introducing the term dowry death for the first time. The law now recognized what had always been true, that these were murders disguised as accidents. Still, conviction rates remained low. The burden of proof fell on grieving families, who faced threats, bribes, and endless court delays. The perpetrators, often the husband and his relatives, continued their lives while the dead were reduced to statistics. Dowry deaths became both a crime and a mirror, reflecting how deep patriarchal violence could run, even within the sanctity of marriage. And yet, even within this despair, stories of defiance began to emerge. Survivors who had escaped the flames became witnesses, activists, and lawyers. They took their pain into the courts, onto the streets, demanding not pity, but justice. Their voices cracked centuries of silence. The story of dowry killings is not only about how women died, it's about how they began to speak. The fight against dowry deaths did not begin in the courtroom. It began in the kitchens, in the whispers between women, and in the pages of diaries smuggled out of homes. In the 1970s, as urbanization spread and women's education began to rise, silence started to crack. Groups of mothers, sisters, and widows gathered in Delhi, Bombay, and Calcutta, holding photographs of daughters burned alive under the guise of accident. Their question was simple, but devastating. If our daughters were happy, why are they all dying the same way? These protests grew into a movement. Organizations like the Mahila Dakshata Samiti, Sri Sangharsh, and others began documenting every dowry death, visiting hospitals, confronting police, and writing reports that reached Parliament. Their language was not political theory. It was human agony translated into proof, and for the first time, the system was forced to look. In 1983, India passed Section 498A of the Penal Code, criminalizing cruelty against wives by husbands and in-laws. 2 years later, Section 304B defined dowry death as a separate offense, punishable by up to life imprisonment. The law stated that if a woman died within 7 years of marriage, under suspicious circumstances related to dowry, the husband's family would be presumed responsible unless proven otherwise. It was a legal revolution, but one written in the blood of thousands. Still, justice remained elusive. Courtrooms became new battlegrounds of gender and power. Defense lawyers often painted the victims as unstable, ungrateful, or disobedient. Police officers mishandled evidence, and judges hesitated to convict without clear motive. In many cases, the fire had destroyed not only the woman's body, but every trace of the truth. Yet the movement persisted. Survivors of attempted burnings began to testify. Women's shelters emerged, offering legal aid and safe refuge. Newspapers started publishing names of victims, of abusers, of corrupt officers. Slowly, shame began to shift from the woman to the perpetrator. But the deeper issue, dowry as a social expectation, refused to die, even among educated families. The transaction remained disguised as gifts, customs, or wedding support. New laws couldn't dismantle the centuries-old belief that a woman's worth was tied to what she brought into her marriage. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, South Asia saw both progress and paradox. Legal awareness increased, but dowry demands persisted in new forms: luxury cars, foreign travel expenses, real estate. The tools of violence evolved too, from open flames to psychological torment. A slap here, a threat there, a reminder of what could happen if the next payment wasn't made. In Pakistan and Bangladesh, similar laws were passed, but enforcement lagged. Religious and cultural conservatism often overpowered justice. In Nepal, women's groups campaigned to make dowry demands socially taboo, using street theater and radio broadcasts to reach rural audiences. Still, reports of bride burnings continued to surface, a haunting reminder that law without change of heart is only paper. What makes dowry deaths uniquely horrifying is how ordinary they became. They didn't happen in dark alleys. They happened in homes filled with relatives. They weren't committed by strangers, but by husbands, mothers-in-law, brothers. Violence had become domestic, ritualized, and accepted. Yet within this horror lies another truth: the courage of those who refuse to disappear quietly. Women like Nisha Sharma, who publicly exposed her groom's dowry demand in front of hundreds, sparking national outrage. Or Rani Devi, who testified against her in-laws after surviving a burning attempt, turning her scars into evidence. Every story that came forward became a crack in the system. Every mother who refused hush money turned her grief into rebellion, and every courtroom victory, no matter how small, became a warning to those who still believed a bride's body could settle a debt. But even now, in the 21st century, the legacy lingers. Every year, thousands of women across South Asia are still killed or driven to suicide over dowry disputes. In many cases, their names never reach the news. Their deaths are recorded as domestic accidents or family quarrels. The tragedy continues because the belief continues that marriage is a transaction, that honor is worth more than empathy, and that silence keeps the peace. But silence is what built this horror in the first place. Dowry killings are not ancient history. They are a mirror, showing us how cultural pride and gender power still intertwine. The same structures that burned women centuries ago now manifest in emotional abuse, financial control, and coercive relationships. Ending dowry violence isn't just about punishing criminals. It is about unlearning centuries of normalized cruelty, about teaching sons that a wife is not a purchase, and daughters that their worth cannot be priced. It's about refusing to excuse violence as culture. The story of dowry deaths is not just a story of loss. It is a call to vigilance. Because every time a family negotiates a dowry, every time a gift becomes an obligation, every time a girl is told she must obey to survive, history begins to repeat. If you think this story belongs to the past, look again. It's still unfolding behind closed doors. And that's why these stories must be told, not for shock, but for change. If you believe history should never be buried, share it. Let these voices be heard. Because silence, as history has shown, only ever protects the guilty.